On the end is
most of those issues will be resolved.
So
That's okay. We'll figure it out one way or the other.
Okay, everybody, if we could please have your attention. That's for that echo. Test. Test. There we go. Okay, thank you, everyone. I'd like to call this meeting to order. This is the Richland County Planning Commission. Today is Wednesday, May 18th, 2022, and this is a work session. So there won't be any, there are no action items on the agenda. There won't be any votes taken to take action, and as a result, will be no public input today. There will be public input opportunities at future hearings before any by this commission. Just as a matter of housekeeping, I want to ask staff to please confirm that the notice requirements under the Freedom of Information Act and our rules of civil procedure have been complied with for this work session.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Right, and if we could also take roll, please.
All right. Yonke.
Aye.
Carlisle. Ryerson.
present.
Metz.
Here.
Grady.
Here.
Taylor. Gilchrist. Branham.
Present.
Dennis.
Here.
Mm,
Have a quorum. All right. Are there any motions for additions or deletions to the agenda? All right. Hearing none, we'll move to item 4 of the agenda, which is the 2021 Land Development Code process, obviously now extending into year 2022. For general informational purposes, for anyone who may not have caught it, there was a county council meeting yesterday evening. The Land Development Code process was an agenda item. However, and it was up for a second reading. The motion being, I believe it was Mr. Malinowski's motion to restart the mapping process, which at our last work session, the Planning Commission already expressed its will to, follow the vote on the first reading by County Council, which was to restart the mapping process. So that's just for informational purposes. The second reading by County Council, there was no vote on that last night, and it's expected that the vote on the second reading on that motion will happen at the June 7th County Council meeting. Nevertheless, as I indicated at our last work session, we expressed that desire to follow the vote, and as such, asked staff to prepare certain materials for today. And staff also asked for specific input from the commissioners from last meeting to today. And so at this time, turn the time over to Benson Ziegler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Assistant County Administrator Eric Jensen for the record. So glad to be with you all today. And if we could cue the PowerPoint, I'm going to walk you all through really quickly what we're going to do today. Very briefly, we're going to have a quick PowerPoint presentation that's going to talk about the statutory obligations and the requirements of the Planning Commission in regards to this process. So it's basically the rules that the state legislature has put together that the Planning Commission and the council must follow while going through this. We're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk a little bit about the restart, in the sense that 5 years ago in 2017, when this process started, the city, or the county, excuse me, had a consultant, and that consultant prepared some materials based on what the work that they had done for the comprehensive plan process and why they were recommending that the code be rewritten. So we'll go through those materials again. Then we're going to talk a little bit about calendaring, when the meetings will be and where they'll be held. And then we're going to go into the actual worksheet exercise that the Planning Commission went through earlier this week. And the handout that I gave to the public earlier it is a slide that'll come up later in the PowerPoint, but I was worried that it might be too small on the screen for everyone to see. So I printed a handout so that you could have it for when we get to that point. So if we go to the next slide, please. So really quickly, South Carolina, like almost every state in the country, has a Planning and Zoning Enabling Act. That's basically the authority to do zoning and planning. So the state legislature must give counties and cities that authority, or they can't do it. And almost every single state in the nation has that authority granted, has granted that authority to their counties and their cities. So, and then of course, in that we found ours here in South Carolina is in Title 6, Chapter 29 of the South Carolina Code of Laws. Okay, next slide, please. So there's two obligations. Oops. Go back into there. So while we're waiting, so typically a planning commission has two duties. One is to prepare and recommend a comprehensive plan to the county council. So that basically means a document that says the county is going to grow, develop in this form or fashion. That's what the comprehensive plan does. The county completed a comprehensive update, or a complete update overhaul of it in 2015. So that was the last time that was done. And you have to then update it every 5 years in South Carolina, or at least you have to revisit it and make sure it's still current every 5 years. And then when you do it, all of your zoning ordinances, your text, your maps, everything must conform to the comprehensive plan per county or per state statute here in South Carolina. Not all states are like that, but in South Carolina, that is the case. The Planning Commission is the body that recommends and prepares the plan to give to the county council. The county council's the body that adopts it. And the planning staff works for the county administrator, but they are the staff to the Planning Commission, who are an advisory board in most functions. Okay, next slide, please. Again, as I mentioned, The Planning Commission is responsible for preparing, amending, recommending your zone maps, your zone text, your comprehensive plan. The council adopts it. Sometimes the Planning Commission holds public hearings, but typically not. In this particular matter, when you're talking about a zoning ordinance, the council is the one that holds the public hearings. The Planning Commission holds public meetings, and they can solicit and ask for public input, but they don't hold a public hearing as required by state law. Next slide, please. So we're going to jump in right now to the original kickoff materials. Again, these were prepared back in 2015 and 2016 by Clarion Associates, who was the consultant the county used to update its comprehensive plan. Clarion was also later selected to assist with rewriting the land code, which resulted in the 2021 land development code that was adopted but not enacted by the council last November. Next slide, please. So we're going to go through these slides really quickly. Again, I did not prepare these slides that you're going to see. These were done in 2016 by Clarion and Associates. Next slide, please. Next slide. So Clarion, oh, sorry, there we go. So Clarion really quickly had, a work program. They had some project goals, priorities, and so forth. This is sort of their process. What we're doing here in our restart is actually kind of similar to that. I'm not going to use all the same materials because we're not doing the zoning code now. We're talking more the map with zoning code on the side. So next, please. So work program and schedule. We're going to talk a little bit more about this today, but you can kind of see this is a typical work program and schedule put together by a national consultant who, does tens, if not hundreds of these. Okay, next slide, please. Potential project goals. So when the comprehensive plan was done, Clarion and Associate pulled these 5 bullet point items out of it and said, when you're updating your land development code, these are the goals or the things that you should be focusing on. Saying you, meaning the county and the county staff and the planning commission and the county council. So you can see one of the goals of updating the zoning ordinance was to implement the comprehensive plan. One was to create a user-friendly code. One was to modernize the zoning districts and development standards. One was to tailor regulations to different contexts. And another was to encourage green building practices. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go through these, but these are just examples of the ways they said, when you're creating a user-friendly code, you should do X, Y, Z. Next slide, please. When you're modernizing zoning districts and development standards, here's what your code should look like. Next slide. When you're, if you want to tailor regulations to different contexts, these are the issues and the things that you need to focus on. Next slide, please. If you're encouraging green building practices, these are the things you need to do in your code. Next slide. And then this last one here is is more on the mapping side of things. It's sort of the code, but text, but it's also the map. And so here, they're talking about once you have your code, the text, the book, the rule book in place, how do you implement that on your map? Which is sort of like, if you like sports like I do, if you can imagine, you have your playbook in football and, they say, you're going to line up and your running back is going to go here and you're going to block here. That's what your map is. Your map is not the rules. Your map is how do you implement the rules? Where do you put things? And so that's what we're talking about. When we're talking map, we're talking about where does this zone go and where does that zone go? And, why do they interact or do they interact or should they interact or is there a conflict? And so you can see these here. These are sort of the project goals that you look for when you get into the mapping part of the process. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is the handout that I gave out to everybody, which I was worried wouldn't be big enough on the screen, and I was right. So essentially, these are the results of the mapping exercise that the planning commissioners and staff did that we talked about at the last meeting at the work session, if you were there. And so on this,
Jensen,
yes,
I'm
sir.
sorry. I get you to pause just for a moment
Yes, sir.
before we move on to that section. Just wanted to see if the commission had any questions or comments about the materials that Mr. Jensen's reviewed thus far.
Only thing I have, could you email that to us? I'd love to see those slides.
Yeah, absolutely. I would be happy to do that.
Thank you.
In fact, we'll post them on the website also, so anybody who wants to can put that in my notes. Thank you.
Anyone else? All right, thank you, Mr. Jensen.
Thank you, Chair. So this is what we call a heat map. So basically what I did was I collected as many commissioners, input as I could, as many results as possible. And I found the codes or the section, the zones, the zone that they had, the most people commented on. So if it's white, that means nobody commented, said that that they had concerns. If it's kind of the lighter pink color, then that means one or two people said, we should be talking about these, whether it's where they go or the uses that are allowed in them right now or something else. And then the darker pink color is basically where at least 3 people said they wanted to talk about this more. So again, this doesn't mean you have to talk about those, or you should or shouldn't. It's just letting you know how many of your colleagues felt that we needed to be talking about those particular things. So it kind of gives you a jumping off point of where you might want to start your discussion.
And Mr. Jensen,
Yes,
just
sir.
to clarify again, this is reflects the gathering of the data from the commission that was provided to you this
Yes,
past
sir.
9 days since the last work session.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And staff also filled one out, so theirs is in there also because obviously, since the code's been adopted but not enacted, they've had opportunities to go back and look at it, and they have, questions and comments on things too.
Okay.
So.
And again, just the darker the color, the more interest there was in discussing or revisiting that zoning district.
Yes, sir. That is
Okay.
correct.
And I'll just highlight as well. We will be looking specifically at a draft of a new zoning map during Mr. Jensen's presentation. I think that's intended to be the primary focus of today's work session, but we definitely want to be, incorporating our thoughts and preparing for potential discussion as it relates to the text of the land development, which includes table. Thank you.
Yes, sir. And so in regards to that, let me just say a couple of things for the benefit of the public more than the council or the commission, excuse me. A typical zoning code has 2 parts. It has the text, again, like I said before, the rules, and then it has the map, which is like the playbook, which is the schematic of how these rules get put into play. And so the council in November adopted the text, again, the rule book, but it's not enacted. It's not, quote unquote, the law of the land. It's not effective right now because you have to have a map or a playbook to go along with it. And the playbook isn't adopted yet, which is the map. So if that makes sense, that's what we're talking about. So really today's exercise and the exercise for the next few months as the planning commission goes through this is going to be saying, how do we enact the code via the map? And are there sections of the code that need to be changed or modified to make it work? Oops, 1 second. So I'll answer this question, but yeah, it's not appropriate for the audience to speak out. You can send me these questions later, but I'll just, again, the code was written between 2017 and 2021, and it was adopted in November of 2021. So that's when the code was adopted by the council. It went to the planning commission reviewed it, recommended it, council reviewed it, made changes, approved it. But again, it's not enacted. It's just sitting on a shelf waiting for the zoning map to be finished. And so once the zone map is adopted, that's when the whole thing goes into effect. And so that's where we are right now. So now we're talking the mapping portion of it, but we also will dive into sections of the code if there are things we notice that need additional adjusting, massaging, modifying to make the mapping work. So that's kind of where we are. So with that, Mr. Chair, that is all I had in terms of a presentation other than the calendar. And let me suggest we do the calendaring now so that we don't have to deal with it at the end of the meeting, if that's okay. Okay. Next slide, please. So really quickly, the Planning Commission typically meets at the beginning of the month on a Monday. And so we are suggesting that we have a series of work sessions following the regular already calendared meetings and a series of special called meetings that would be in the evening, so we can get a group of, daytime and evening meetings. And so that is the proposed calendar is the one you see on the screen there. So basically, today we're having the special call. That's where we are right now. Then Monday, June 6th is your normally calendared meeting. So we're recommending a work session following that. And then Monday, June 20th, a special called at 5:30. These are all Mondays, by the way, because that's when the council chambers are available. And we would hope to be able to live stream all of these meetings. And then again on June 11th, following your regular meeting. On August 1st, following your regular meeting. On August 15th, a special call at 5:30. And then on Thursday, September 8th, following your regular meeting. And so that would give you effectively 6 more meetings beyond this to talk. And then if you needed more, we would schedule more going out. So that is the calendar that is recommended for you. You obviously don't have to make a decision tonight, but we wanted to bring that to your attention so that you can start deciding how often you want to meet and when.
Thank you. And unless somebody on the commission has a comment or any input right now, I would just leave it as a proposed schedule, subject to change. I guess I would recognize the fact that we talked at the last work session about, a general sequencing that we hoped to follow when it comes to a new baseline zoning map being presented today, then us having an additional meeting where we would probably come back with thoughts and input on what we were able to review as presented today. And then potentially, from there, seeing a revised zoning map, and then moving on to the part of the process where we would probably talk more in depth about potential amendments to the text of the land development code. So, I think it's good to lay this out as these being potential dates, but I don't, I don't want to commit us necessarily to needing each and every one of these meetings. We may very well, and I think it's 4 out of the upcoming 6 would just follow our regularly scheduled meeting anyway. So I think a wait and see approach is probably advisable. Anybody else on the commission have any comments on that?
Chair.
Yes, Mr. Dim.
I'm down to meet anytime. I've already moved family vacation for the July 11th. However, the June 20th, if that does go down, I will not be there. That is the anniversary. So if you guys want to see me at any more meetings, I will need to be at the anniversary dinner.
Yeah, we'll cover for you. Should be okay. And just for the record, Mr. Commissioner Taylor joined us. All right. Mr. Jensen.
Thank you, sir. So we have the map that the draft map today. And again, this is the baseline map. So this has no changes other than literally what we had on the screen in terms of, there you go. This becomes this, this becomes this. That is what the baseline map does. And since there are a couple of zones that have multiple options, or at least 2 options, we basically on the map left those as what the current zone is called today. So for example, if it was rural, we say rural -TBD, because, depending on how this ends up, if it gets modified, if it changes from what's in the current code, we don't know what it could become. But even if it doesn't, we don't know which of the 2 the Planning Commission is going to recommend. And, and maybe you'll recommend something completely different for an area. We just don't know. So again, where you have more than one options on this direct translation, we put the old code, the old zoning name, and a TBD to acknowledge that, that the new code recommends at least 2, if not more, for that same old code, old zoning designation. Yes, sir. Yeah, if you're ready to put it up. Yes, please, sir. So we'll bring up that map now for your review and you can start discussing. Again, this is just a straight translation. This is what the zone map would look like if we followed per the letter what county council approved in 2021.
Right. The table 26-1.9E from the Land Development Code as adopted.
Yep, and if it's okay, I'm going to step down and I'll turn the time over to the commission and to planning manager Brian Crooks, who prepared this map.
Thank you, Mr. Brooks, whenever you're ready.
I mean, I think Mr. Jensen summed it up pretty well in terms of what this is. So basically taking that equivalency table and kind of going from when we had I would say an exact match, put it that way. So we were going from either 1-to-1 or many to one, then that's what this becomes. Where we had a situation where we were going from one to many, then as Mr. Jensen stated, that's where we have the current zoning district dash TBD. And so that's pretty much, it's pretty much where we have everything that is in some type of hash symbology here. That's what that's going to be. And so let me try and do this so that way we can get a better look at it. So just kind of, again, looking at the legend, how some of that plays out. So as I said, so where it's 1-to-1 or many to one, those get consolidated to just that one in terms of this baseline map. Where we had a 1-to-many, that's where we need a little bit additional guidance as it relates to determining what that could potentially be. So in this instance where we had RU in that equivalency table, where RU is listed as AG or HM, or is it one of those in particular, or is it something else in particular that could work better? Same way for the rural residential district, the manufactured home district particularly. So some of these others where there is no exact match, or it is something that is being deleted altogether and we would need to identify something. So in particular to that being the manufactured home district, where really from staff's perspective could really be a handful potentially on how that plays out, at least as the code exists now. But based on some of the input and feedback that we've been hearing related to some of those districts, one of those potential candidates, particularly the R2, may not necessarily be the most appropriate in that case anymore. So how some of the ways that the MH plays out currently from a use or standard standpoint, that's some of the things that we're going to have to take into consideration with this. And I will note that, I think one of the things that we're trying to get to is a truer translation table, where presently within the code, we have this equivalency table. So looking at things that are the most similar as it relates to intent, development type of character that you would generally get with that district, where a translation table, you're looking more so at things related to the district standards and the use standards themselves, where it is something treated as equal versus something that's, it could be, but it may not necessarily is. So I think that's really where we're wanting to get with a lot of this as well, from a translation standpoint too, versus having it be considered an equivalent. So I think that's some of the guidance that we're looking for here is really these kind of 5 districts in particular, as well as some of these others, to begin building towards that translation table.
Thank you. So as for M1 on the code table, that would just be,
I believe in the equivalency table we had it as EMP or LI, if I remember correctly. I'm not sure off the top of my head which one it was specifically, but it was, I think, both of those.
double check that. The version of the code I'm looking at just had it as a straight EMP. So otherwise, single to multiples, you had rural, the old, quote unquote, old rural residential, and then the OI being the office. And then, as you indicated, old/current code, there is a standalone MH manufactured home zoning district, but under the new code as it's currently drafted, that does not exist. And so it would have been intended to be incorporated within other zoning.
Here.
Yes, Mr. Taylor.
Clarification, so we'll comment out the end.
That would be correct. Yeah. So
Right.
sorry, when I was looking at the wrong side of the wrong chart. So yeah, so the M1 should be EMP. So that one should not be one that we would necessarily need to worry with, at least at this time.
First glance, I know this is new to everybody here on the commission, but everybody on the commission, anybody got, initial comments or discussion, we'll certainly plan to make time for that at our next meeting or work session. As you indicated, we'll need to work through potentially finding a district 1 to 2. Do you have any initial recommendations for, the criteria we would use to choose, for example, in the RU district? How would you choose between the AG versus the HM?
So for those, I would look at what is the standard of the current district. So in terms of lot width or the density equivalent, how does that look? What are setback standards? And then what are the use allowances? So for instance, AG and HM, those are also significantly less dense than what the RU allows for. It also has a larger use permissions in certain instances, such as the AG, versus what the RU would allow for currently. And then, so from a more facial standpoint, so looking at it almost as a one-to-one, I think staff standpoint on this, RT is the most true translation of the RU district, even though it is a less dense district. But in terms of what the standards are, what the use allowances are, and then everything else that kind of goes around with that, RT is the most similar to what the RU is in existence now. I think it also goes back to too, is the AG and HM being special purpose districts versus being a residential district that is very low intensity, more, say, rural. I don't want to use necessarily rural as a term for it, but more agricultural uses, but not to the scale and extent that the HM and AG would allow for. Does that make sense?
We should think about AG and HM as more purpose district.
Correct. Yeah. And those are specifically within the text special purpose districts versus being a residential district as RT through R6R.
Have a sense offhand for what the density is from current RU to RT?
It would drop by half. So the RT has a density of 0.67 versus a 1.33 or 1.32. But in terms of, so the density drops by half, but the land uses, the various standards that go along with it would be the same generally as the RU otherwise. So things from a accessory dwelling standpoint, or just an accessory structure, accessory use, as well as the use permissions themselves would be pretty comparable, if not the exact same as to what the RU now would be.
Just wanted to clear something up for the audience out there. The RT, the old density is 1.32, and this code brought it down to 0.67 per acre. So just wanted to let y'all know that. So
It's old
Points.
density for what?
the old density was 1.32 and the new density is 0.67.
So
Under
for the
1.32.
rural zoning district in the
For the RT.
2005 code would be 1.32, so 33,000 square feet. The RT, what I'm saying is the most true equivalent. So what is the most, to me, from staff's perspective, the most same district on its face would be RT, even though the density is 0.67, which is half of the 2005 RU density. So this is not to say that it's, because they're two separate districts. So I think that's one thing that we still have to keep in mind is, these are going to be the RU is going to be one where there's no true translation. And I think that was one of the issues that we've had and that we've seen because, there's really 4 replacements for RU. R1, so from a straight density standpoint, it's the same density, but from a land use perspective, nowhere near. So in terms of that case, R1 is the most true equivalent to RR because it's the same level of density, same use permissions, et cetera. So for RU, there's no real good case, but RT is the most similar in terms of what the use allowances are, what the density is, and in terms of looking at it from a holistic perspective from all of the different points of view.
How do you feel about the OI to employment or institutional?
I think
How would that criteria go choosing between the two?
so. The INS again. So we're looking at it come from a facial perspective is going to be the most, I would say, comparable thing. But the issue there lies the standards where the INS has a 5-acre minimum in this code. So that would be one thing that we would then need to take a look at as it relates to that district specifically. But in terms of use permissions, the various standards that's allowed within it, very similar to the office and institutional district. So you're primarily looking at, again, commercial office institutional uses as the name kind of implies, as the OI is now. But that 5-acre minimum requirement on the INS district, that's really kind of the biggest thing. Because the EMP, the employment district, where it also facilitates larger office complexes, that would be the most truer sense to the OI. But the EMP is vastly different than the OI as well in terms of use permissions, the intensity of that district, where it's EMP is almost a hybrid heavy commercial industrial district, where it's intended more so for things like manufacturing, but you can still have larger employment complexes as well that were offices. So
Look at the EMP. When you look at the current map, can you identify parcels that likely should be qualifying as EMP? I mean, it's not like or is that something you see just being implemented proactively?
yeah, it would be more of a context based scenario. So it'd really be, how is that OI? What is the use? And then what is the surrounding characteristics of that? So what are the adjacent land uses? What do those look like? So, I think we can zoom in to one of these sections over here. So we'll look at Clemson Road, for instance. So there's several properties that are zoned HI along Clemson Road. So this is the hard scrabble Clemson Road intersection here, where the hand is, going towards where we turn into Killian over here at Longtown. So all of these right in here, those are OI. So those would not be appropriate situations where those become EMP. INS would be more appropriate within those cases, or another district entirely, depending on what it is. So for instance, one of the MU districts, potentially. Conversely to that then, as we go over to off of Percival Road, where we have some residential right now, but we also have some light industrial, heavier commercial also. So, what could that then become as well? But also, what is the other policy guidance that we have in relation to some of those things? Is there a PIA or anything like that in relation to it? So it would really just depends. What is the circumstances? What's the situation of that site for really what could be the most appropriate district? But again, on its face, INS would be the most true replacement for what it's trying to achieve, but we would need to then make modifications to that district for the zoning district standards itself.
Are there, I don't know how to say, like sufficiently few parcels in the county with that OI designation currently that you would be able to review each one?
We could, but I would just say it most cases INS just from a straight translation standpoint would just be I'm just not going to say the easier option, but in terms of going through and looking at them without, because again, if we looked at each site individually without looking at the area as a whole, I mean, I don't know how beneficial that would be, because we want to be looking at everything in context with everything else around it versus just narrowing in on one site and saying, okay, that site could be this, could be that, could be this, without taking into consideration what everything else around it might or could be.
Something?
So the EMP district, that's kind of like all encompass. So, I mean, you could have some residential in there, along with other types of businesses, kind of like best way to put it, like Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. Remember how he had his little town there and the industrial area?
Yes and no. So there are 2 residential uses that would be allowed at this time. One is apartments, so multifamily, apartments, townhomes, and then the other one is townhomes. Both of those are allowed by special exception. So in terms of a residential use, as we typically think of them from a dwelling perspective, only things that are allowed are also have to do those additional use permissions. Those are the only 2 that would be allowed. Everything else from a use standpoint, you're looking at pretty much industrial uses or office or heavier commercial uses for the most part. So some limited retail, but mainly looking at offices, and again, kind of playing into the name, you're really looking at job generating and more so in those employment type uses. So factories, processing, manufacturing, as well as being able to have those kind of secondary, tertiary uses to support those employment uses as well. So that's where those special exception permissions for the residential uses come into play.
Under the new code, would those go before?
Yes.
Those?
Yes. So those would go before the Board of Zoning Appeals for those 2 uses.
So that, Commissioners, it seems like that's kind of example of a conversation where maybe that's pointing us to an amendment of the text to suit practical app. I don't know how close I have to get it to hear me, but here we are. So yeah, I just was saying that the conversation, it seems like it's pointing us towards, a potential need to amend the text because of the practical, elements involved in applying the code to a map. So otherwise, it sounds like we need to think on, and if not discuss more today, the conversion of, rural to new zoning districts, one of the 2 potentially, and then the rural residential to 1 or 2 or more. If we followed what I hear from Mr. Crooks, and potentially we amended the text on the INS to reduce the minimum lot size, that would probably resolve the OI.
It'd be the minimum district size.
Minimum district size.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Anybody else offhand, like any other further thoughts or comments? Anybody want to ask, to zoom in on any specific area at the moment?
Mr. Chair, just briefly to kind of go back to some of the points you were making just a second ago. So I would say for RR, in terms of, again, facially, R1 would be the most similar. So from, again, standard standpoint and a use standpoint, pretty much the exact same thing. There would be some modifications that we as staff would still recommend for that district. And I think as we had, discussions previously, this was one of the districts that we were looking at going to be proposing certain ones. And so in this case, it would be the lot width requirement, where I think it's 50 right now, but looking at having that be much greater, whether that's 90, whether that's 120 feet, something along those lines. So there would be potential for that modification, but otherwise is pretty much the same exact district that the RR is.
Essentially, we would need increase the lot width
Yes,
requirement for
yes.
R1.
For it
to
to be
make
a
it work.
more true match to the RR. Yes.
Dennis,
So we're talking about the RR. The most equivalent would, you're thinking RT and R1 versus the homestead?
Yeah, R1 more specifically.
Okay.
Just from a land use standpoint, it would R1 would pretty much be almost an exact replica of the RR, because RR is the same, pretty much the same district standards as the RU is, but it doesn't have the same use permissions, as well as things related to accessory structures and things of that nature. So the RR is pretty much the RU, but solely residential uses only. And so the R1 keeps the 2005 RU's density, so 1.33 density. So, but it doesn't have the various land uses that would have made RT or HM or something else more appropriate. R1 then is again on its face, the most replica of the RR district.
Do you think that RSE also fits R1 pretty close as far as land uses and?
Land uses, yes, but from a density standpoint, it is closer to R2 than it is R1. Just from looking at kind of what the lot size of the RSE allows for, it's much closer to the R2 in terms of what that density equivalent is than R1. Yeah, and I will note for RR and RSE that they're really only mapped in a handful of locations. So all of the RRs are really in the north central portion of the county. So point them out to you real quick here. So group here, and a group here. And that's only places that I'm aware of where we do have RR mapped presently. And then RSE, there's roughly 40 something properties throughout the county that are mapped as RSE. We've got this group here that's currently RSE. And then we've got this one here that was recently approved by council. And at the top of my head, those are the only ones that I'm aware of, but there's roughly 40 or so.
Thank you.
in light of what we talked about earlier, INS compared to OI, do you still feel good about going from M1 to EMP?
Yes. Yeah. I think, again, kind of looking at things, trying to be more so an exact match, M1 and EMP are relatively close to what they try to do, what they try to achieve, where M1 for, in most instances, I mean, really where you're looking at it being mapped and what uses are allowed, it's really kind of this kind of combo commercial with a variety of industrial allowances. Presently, M1 does not allow for residential uses though. So that would be kind of one of the differences. But otherwise, just from a general land use perspective, as well as standard perspective, those are very similar to what it is.
So, just based on kind of looking back and seeing that there is a one-to-one equivalency there, would you go ahead and update this map
Yeah,
to reflect? Okay, M1 goes to EMP.
And Mr. Chair, what I would say is, as we continue conversation, if the commission feels like they have, they may want to see how some of these things may look, we can create multiple versions of this if that helps continue the dialogue. So we could see, what this could look like if everything that was RU goes to AG, if everything goes to HM, everything goes to RT, what some of that may look like, how some of those things could be play out stuff like that. Same way with, say, RR, if we felt, hey, what would this look like if it was RT? What would this look like if it was R1? Things like that. So we could create multiple versions of this as well, if there wasn't one specific one that, say, the commission felt comfortable with. There was just still wanted to be a little bit more dialogue, a little bit more conversation. And again, I think this is kind of, again, coming from a baseline standpoint, wanting to get to then a translation map specifically, and then look at how we move forward from there.
Yeah, I think if we can still label it the first iteration of the remap with M1 going to EMP, it just takes one more thing potentially off the table that feels wide open.
Yeah. So I guess just as it relates to that, Mr. Chair, I'd point out, so we would just label the next one. Once we had a better idea, this would be 0.2.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yes, Mr. Dennis.
Technical question. On this map, if we edit it and we click on one of the zones, and I want to change it, will it change it all? Or I'm only asking because that way I wouldn't have to wait on you guys to do things. I could do things in real time.
No, it does not look like it, because it's all showing as one single layer versus layers individually.
Okay.
I mean, we could do that if you would like, but it's.
I use it in my work all the time, and I know
it
takes a while. So I didn't know if it's already set up like that. So disregard that.
Yeah. I mean, we can, if that's really what the commission would want, I would just probably advise
that would
that
be
we don't, because it's one, it's a little redundant, and two, it's cumbersome.
It's a time waster. I didn't know if it was already set up. I was just going to ask.
And I know again that, we looked at the kind of the heat map on the equivalency table. Mr. Jensen shared that earlier. So today is not the end of the discussion of this matter. And I know that many of us intend to still address the 2 to 4plex question with potential text amendments, but that's not for today. And then again, manufactured home, we still need to work on that. Mr. Crooks, you had a recommendation there?
That was the one I was going to bring up next.
Okay.
So I just wanted to see what else conversation, dialogue, questions commissioners had before we kind of moved on to that one. But this is one of those that, like I said, there's a couple of potential replacements for it from staff's perspective. Really, we're kind of looking at 3 potential options. One being R2 at the moment, one being R5, and then the other being R3. So kind of looking at those differently. So the MH district is really, it's kind of I'm going to say it's a special district in the current code. It's not mapped a whole lot, but where we do have it, it's mainly looking at either manufactured home as we particularly think about it, or a manufactured home park, or it's just kind of a middle density lot size, if you will. So from a land use and standard perspective, R2 is kind of that's the way we say R2 is a replacement, because R2 currently would allow for manufactured homes. It's let's say the highest density district that allows for a single manufactured home. R5 is yes. So that is the most intense district that would allow a single manufactured home. So if you're doing a single site manufactured home, that's the most intense district that you could do that in, as the code is currently written. The R5 district is the most intense district that allows for a manufactured home park. So manufactured home parks in the code, it's R5, I want to say RT, and I think HM. So really only a handful of districts. And so, previously the way that we've been looking at this is R2 and R5 being the most common replacements in terms of how we've been previously recommending the map to play out. So that's been one of the most common areas that we recommended R5 being, was where we have an existing manufactured home park in a, let's say, urban or more intense suburban area. And so that's where we kind of get into a little issue with this is, well, for a manufactured home park, R5 is appropriate most cases, but for a MH zone property that's just a single manufactured home, it's R2, because that's going to be the most intense thing from a lot size perspective and things of that nature, because the MH is, I think, 7,260 square feet or so, I think is what the minimum lot size is within the 2005 code. So this is saying the other potential thing is R3, because it has the most similar lot size equivalent from a density standpoint, but it doesn't have any of the use permissions. So this is one of those things where we're probably going to have to look at a couple of different tweaks textually for whatever we really look at being the best replacement for MH. And I would point out too, is for the MH district, I don't necessarily think that depending on how that replacement looks from a translation standpoint, would be wholly appropriate, because of the variety of areas contextually where it is currently mapped. So you have more rural areas, more urban areas, in between areas, highly urban areas. So the context of where that exists varies significantly throughout the county. So if we mapped everything as R5, well, you could have some places within the county that's R5, but not necessarily appropriate. So that is one thing I would like to point out with some of these things. And I think that's also, again, looking at this from an iterative standpoint, if we're going to be looking at translation, well, do we need to look at being proactive with how certain areas should map? And I think that plays into that conversation as well. But I would just kind of note that as being a potential issue with the MH district, depending on what that replacement is, what that replacement looks like. Definitely going to probably need textual changes, but also how that looks within the map as the whole, from a translation standpoint, and then different iterations later on as we look at a map from a whole standpoint and things related to implementing the comp plan, if you will.
2021 draft of the LDC, it allows for single manufactured homes in R2 and manufactured home parks in R5 by right. Is it permitted? There's no
a special requirement.
Okay.
So by right, but they're going to have additional standards that they're going to have to meet.
And the special requirement doesn't go to Board of Zoning Appeals, right?
No.
That's just staff.
Yes.
Okay.
Staff review if you meet those requirements.
Have recommendation?
Well, I think this is one of the things that, at least from an R2 standpoint, I think we've heard a lot of feedback as it relates to the manufactured home use within that. And I think from our standpoint, maybe moving those allowances to more intense districts. So, whether that is having R5 and R4 and R6 have those, I think from just, from a professional standpoint for me, I'm one of those people, I'm okay with it kind of in every district, because it is, at least in Richland County, how we look at it, that's affordable housing option in most cases, because it does allow you to purchase your land, but you're not having to buy an expensive house that goes along with it. It also could allow you to have a lower lot or lower price lot that you can purchase, do that. So it really opens up a lot of housing choice as it relates to that. But I know that's not always going to be the politically expedient, route to take, but it's going to be one of those things interesting as how we can handle it. I do think R4 and R5 textually, again, having that use permission could be appropriate. But I really don't have necessarily a good answer. I think it's really looking at probably splitting the two. So basically, where we have a manufactured home park, when it's in, I'd say a more urban, more intense suburban area, R5. Where we have, say, single site development right now, I'd say R2. If we do make textual changes to remove that use, we're going to have to find another replacement for that instead. And that's the similar process that we've taken so far as staff throughout this mapping process related to that district as well. That's also some of the guidance that we received from the consultant when we started the drafting process for this, how to potentially look at handling the MH district. So that kind of follows their guidance, that follows the same process that we've taken. But I do think, this is going to be a point where we're going to have a lot more conversation, a lot more kind of deep dive, if you will, into how that replacement could go. And it may not be that we have a good translation replacement for this. Maybe it is just, it's just a deleted district. And then as we go through the process, where we have it mapped, maybe that's part of iteration 2, iteration 3, when we're looking at other factors besides just straight translation. So,
Sure. Mr. Dennis.
So how many for a mobile or manufactured home park, how many is in one? Like 5 or more, 4 or more? Or
I think the density is capped at 6 per acre.
6.
I think
6 per
that's,
acre.
yeah, give me a second, Mr. Dennis.
I couldn't find it in my
It's
homework
going
that I was
to
doing.
be in that use requirement, I believe. Yes, so it's on page 4-15, Mr. Dennis. So subsection 6A, 1 and 2. So you're going to have a required site acreage of at least 5 acres. And then maximum density of a manufactured home park shall be 6 units per acre. So even if you were in the R5 where you could have a density of 12, you're still, for a manufactured home park, be limited to 6 units per acre.
Do we have to have, or can we just or SE determination or an SR determination on another district, such as, R5 on here is showing on the use table is showing SR, which is permitted by right, subject to special requirements.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that the commission could look at for sure. And I think that's probably the approach that we're going to have to take, is looking at those use permissions for what may be a more appropriate district. So maybe that's where, if we feel like, say, R3 is a appropriate district from a land use, or excuse me, from a district standard perspective, but it doesn't have that land use, but commission, council, whoever's not comfortable with allowing it by right, well, maybe that's where we have a special exception, but we make sure that we have the appropriate standard that goes along with that for that review. That's also things where we can look at related to, say, design reform standards or compatibility standards as part of the general development standards as well. And those are some of the things that we as staff has discussed as relates to some of this so far. But yeah, I think use permission is a good way to try to look at this. And I think that's going to be the route that we're going to take no matter what.
We could look at an area that already has it zoned and then see what's around there and kind of base footprint off of that, instead of just creating a whole new area for it.
So, sorry, Mr. Jones, so in terms of, how that use permission looks and how that use permission works. I think that's something that we can look at. So I guess to your point, not having to create a new district or not having to necessarily overly modify, I guess. Yeah. So, but I think, we do want to necessarily be clear to, what some of those differences between, say, a special requirement and a special exception are. Special exception, yes, you're going before the Board of Zoning Appeals, and there may be certain standards or additional criteria that have to be met, but it's one of those things where, if those standards are met, those standards are met. Same way with the special requirements, it's just that level of, I'm going to say, review. There's additional notices and things that go along with that then versus it being a by right use. So that's not to say that it couldn't still be established. It's just that the way that it is established is a little bit different, and there's a couple more hoops and hurdles that you have to jump through in that case. And so, I mean, that's something that we can definitely look at as use permissions, but I do think that we probably want to have a larger discussion then on some of those differences between special requirement and special exception and how those work and how those play out.
Thank you.
Mr. Grady.
Just for point of clarification, maybe for the benefit of the audience and to refresh my memory, what exactly is the definition of a manufactured home in the code? Does that include modular construction? Is it anything where any part of the home is built off site, or is it exclusively like mobile home trailers, your stereotypical?
So it does not include, say, a modular. But give me just a second, Mr. Grady, and I will read you the definition that we have in here. So manufactured home is a factory-built single-family structure that is manufactured under the authority of 42 USC Section 5401, National Manufactured Home Construction and Safety Standards Act, is transportable in one or more section, is built on a permanent chassis, and is used as a place of human habitation. The term manufactured home shall not include prefabricated modular dwellings placed on a permanent foundation, nor shall it include travel trailers, campers, or similar units designed for recreation or other short-term uses.
Okay, that was my assumption, but that's clarifying. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yes, since we're on the topic too, can we talk about, people that may currently be living in a manufactured home, would they be grandfathered in as a
Yes.
non-conforming use?
Yeah, so they would, anybody, so say it went to no changes in use permissions or anything, and everything that is that is MH gets translated to R3 because it's the most similar lot standard. They would all just be grandfathered in at that point. So as long as that use was legally established, they're able to continue on doing that use. So this is also where we have, I think just manufactured homes in general throughout the county. We have a lot of non-conforming ones, just by nature and how the use permissions and a lot of things are set up within the code. So it would pretty much be the same process as we have now.
Would they need to apply
In terms
to
of,
be a non-conforming
no,
use?
no,
Okay.
yeah.
No, they would not. All right. Thank you. That's a lot of good information, Mr. Crooks, and thank you for your work on that. Once you make that one correction, quote unquote, would you be able to post this to the county's website?
Yeah. We can do that.
Estimated time of arrival for that posting?
I'm not going to be overly aggressive here because I don't want to promise anything and not deliver. So I would probably say at least close the business by Friday.
Okay, by Friday. All right. Thank you.
That'll be on the planning department webpage. Not necessarily sure where it's going to be going on there yet. We may try to move everything up a little bit higher to the top, but it'll at least be on there, and we'll probably try to call it out a little bit more specific to something related to the restart versus the information that's on there currently.
Okay. I think it's a lot to think about. Any other discussion this evening? If not, we could just move ahead to talk about our next meeting. All right. Our next regularly scheduled meeting is it June 4th? Anybody have that?
Should be June the 6th.
June 6th.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. June 6th. Unless somebody really wants it, I would say let's just plan for our next meeting to be on June 6th. What time do we have on the 3 o'clock for the proposed calendar? Okay. All right. Yeah. And at that meeting, I guess let's talk about, whether we could go ahead and create an opportunity for public input on this topic. I think we should probably do that just in case we want to make any motions as to the map at that meeting. I believe the FOIA requirements would have us, have a public input at that meeting. All right.
Sure.
Yes, Mr. Dennis.
So the next meeting, we're going to seek public input on that. And then as far as changing anything, if we have anything that we want to try to make a motion on, then should commissioners bring it at that?
Say definitely as to the map, right? Trying to focus on the map, but definitely the map is causing us to, look at potential needs for text amendments. So
I think a few things, if we do some text amendments, might help inline the map.
yeah. Okay.
I got some things, but I really need to look at it and see how the text would change the map. So, I mean,
Yeah, if we could just ask staff, let's plan on putting on the agenda for the next meeting, both, the zoning map as well as potential text amendments.
what I'm hitting at is kind of like the manufactured home area.
Right.
Go one way or another. That way we could make the text amendments to align, and then we don't have to make a new district if we decide to go that way. But it gives us the chance.
Right.
So
True.
Mr. Chair, just to
Yes.
clarify, so for next meeting, we're wanting to have an area on the agenda for public input on the map, and then also having items on the agenda for discussion of text and map amendments. Is that correct?
Yeah, I
Okay.
think so.
I just wanted to clarify that I heard that correctly.
I mean, we might not bring anything to the text amendments, but if we do find something
Yeah.
after this,
Yeah.
we might be able to.
That's why I
head
just
it
wanted to
off.
clarify that. Would make sure we have it on the agenda on
Right.
there. Because it's the same way with like how we've had, pretty much the last 6-7 meetings we've had the on there as part of the discussion for action. The one section we've been talking about for 7 months now. So where it's on there to be able to discuss. And so if there is a motion from you all as a body to direct staff to do X, Y, or Z thing, we would be able to do that as part of the agenda.
But yeah, I hope everybody's got a sense for, what we ought to look at next time around. I know I definitely need to look at RU and RR. And then manufactured home. And then again, I know we'll get family discussion as well. Else you all my body. Can we get an update on the posting of the minutes of prior meetings to county website? Mr. Price, you want to update us on that? No?
Okay, presently, the minutes, and we went back a few years, up to 2018 to have all of the minutes from the planning commission posted on the county website. I believe there have been a few placed now at this time, but my contact in IT is continuing to work to add those to the website. So kind of expect toward the end of the week, maybe the early next week, it should be complete. Now, with the understanding there will be some gaps in there. And so the planning commission members will probably be seeing me in the next couple of days, bringing a number of minutes to you that you have not approved, primarily from last year and some this year. I'll bring those to you so that at your next meeting, you can go ahead and give approval, if it's so desired, and then we would then place those on the webpage.
Good. We're making progress and got a timeline there. Sounds pretty reasonable to me. All right, well, anything else from staff? If not, Chair will entertain a motion to adjourn. All right, we have a motion. Is there a second? Okay, all in favor, please raise your hand. Vote unanimous.